There are places deep in the woods where the shadows hide more than just the absence of light, where whispers follow you, eyes watch you, and ancient legends come to life. I thought I knew the forest, its secrets and its beauty, until I ventured too far, stayed too late, and listened too closely. From eerie whispers around a campfire, to glowing eyes stalking in the darkness, and footsteps that matched my every move, the deep woods held terrifying encounters I could never forget. If you dare to explore, remember, some things in the forest are meant to remain unseen and unheard. You know, there was this one time I decided to go camping deep in the woods, and let me tell you, it was the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started as a simple weekend getaway. I wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, so I packed my gear and headed out to this remote forest I'd heard about from a friend. The first day was perfect. I found a nice clearing, set up my tent, and spent the day hiking and exploring. The deeper I went into the woods, the more serene it felt. The tall trees, the fresh air, the sounds of nature. It was all so calming. But as dusk started to settle in, that serenity began to shift into something more unsettling. I was sitting by the campfire, roasting marshmallows when I first noticed it. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, suddenly fell silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. I shrugged it off at first, figuring it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. It was so soft that I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely there. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and started to investigate. As I moved away from the campfire, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. I know. Every horror story starts with someone doing something stupid like this. But at that moment I wasn't scared, I was intrigued. I walked for what felt like hours following the whispers until I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Windows broken, door hanging off its hinges, the whole 9 yards. But the whispering was louder here, almost as if it was coming from inside. I stepped through the door, and the air inside was thick and musty. My flashlight beam danced across the room, revealing old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. And then I saw it, an old diary lying on a rickety table. I picked it up and started to read. It belonged to someone named Margaret, who had lived in the cabin with her husband decades ago. The last entry was chilling. It spoke of strange noises in the woods, voices calling out to her, and her husband's sudden disappearance. As I read the last line, the whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I could see my breath forming in front of me. That's when I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but there was nothing there. Without wasting another second, I bolted out of the cabin and ran back to my campsite. The whispering followed me the entire way, growing louder and more frantic. By the time I reached my tent, I was out of breath and terrified. I grabbed my stuff, doused the fire, and hightailed it out of there. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered in those woods. Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? Who knows? All I know is that I'll never forget those whispers and that cold, oppressive feeling that followed me out of the woods. So, if you ever decide to go camping in a remote forest, remember my story. Sometimes the peace and quiet you're seeking might just be hiding something much more sinister. You won't believe this, but there's another story I have from when I ventured into the deep woods. This one still gives me chills just thinking about it. It was supposed to be a fun weekend of fishing with a buddy of mine, Jake. We'd heard about this secluded lake deep in the forest that was supposed to be a gold mine for big catches, so of course we had to check it out. We hiked in early in the morning, the trail getting narrower and more overgrown as we went. By the time we reached the lake, it felt like we were in another world entirely. The place was stunning, clear water surrounded by thick trees and not a soul in sight. We set up our camp and got our fishing gear ready. The first few hours were bliss. We were catching fish left and right, joking around and just enjoying the peace. But then, as the sun started to dip below the tree line, things took a turn. It started with a weird feeling like we were being watched. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me. But then Jake noticed it too. We both scanned the tree line, but but there was nothing there, just shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves. As night fell, we made a fire and cooked some of the fish we'd caught. We were sitting around telling stories when we heard it, a distant, echoing howl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was low and mournful, almost human-like. We looked at each other and I could tell Jake was as spooked as I was. We tried to brush it off, but the howling kept getting closer, punctuated by moments of eerie silence. Then we started hearing footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the underbrush just beyond the reach of our firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it towards the sound, but all I could see were the trees and darkness. That's when we saw the eyes. Two glowing yellow eyes staring at us from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal. My heart was racing, and I could see Jake was freaking out too. We decided to pack up and leave right then and there. We doused the fire and grabbed our gear as quickly as we could. The whole time those eyes followed us, moving silently through the trees. We hiked back to the main trail as fast as we could, our flashlights barely piercing the inky blackness around us. Just when we thought we were safe, the howling started again, this time much closer. It was so loud, it felt like it was right next to us. We broke into a run, adrenaline pumping through our veins. The footsteps behind us matched our pace, never faltering. Finally, we burst out of the woods and into the clearing where we'd parked our car. We jumped in and sped off, not daring to look back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, miles away from the forest, we both just sat there in stunned silence. To this day, neither of us knows what was out there in those woods. Maybe it was some kind of animal, or maybe something else entirely. All I know is there are things in the deep woods that we're better off not knowing about. So if you ever hear a strange howl in the middle of nowhere, take my advice. Get out while you still can. Oh man, let me tell you about this other time I had a creepy encounter in the deep woods. This one happened a few years back when I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head. I had a lot going on and thought some time alone in nature would do me good. So I packed my backpack and headed out to a forest known for its beautiful but remote hiking trails. The first day was pretty uneventful. I found a nice spot to set up camp next to a babbling creek. The sound of the water was soothing, and I spent the evening just enjoying the peace and quiet, reading a book by the fire. It was perfect, until night fell. I was just settling into my sleeping bag when I heard a noise outside my tent. It sounded like someone or something was walking around. I figured it was probably just a deer or some other animal, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then, I heard it again. This time it was closer, and it sounded like whispering. Now I don't know about you, but hearing whispers in the middle of the forest is enough to make anyone's skin crawl. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. I decided to ignore it and try to get some sleep, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. The whispering stopped as soon as I was out of the tent. I walked around a bit, trying to see if I could find the source, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. I went back to my tent, but sleep was out of the question. I lay there wide awake, listening. Hours passed, and just when I started to drift off, I heard it again. This time, the whispering was accompanied by the sound of something scraping against the tent fabric. My heart was pounding, and I knew I had to find out what it was. I burst out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints, circling my campsite. The whispers turned into soft, mocking laughter, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I pointed my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. At that point, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking back towards my car. It was still dark and the trail was hard to follow, but I was too scared to wait until morning. As I hiked, I kept hearing footsteps behind me, keeping pace but never getting closer. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more chaotic. It felt like an eternity, but I finally made it back to my car just as the first light of dawn was breaking. I threw my stuff in the back and sped out of there, not daring to look back. When I got home, I did some research on the area and found out that there were legends about those woods, stories of people who had disappeared, lured away by ghostly whispers. They say the forest is haunted by the spirits of those who were lost, forever wandering and trying to draw others into their fate. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but after that night, I'm not so sure. All I know is, I'm never going back to those woods again. So if you ever hear whispers in the night while you're camping alone, take my advice and get out of there fast. Some things are better left alone.